Hi, I'm Gary Socha. I'm the beer whisperer at Casa Vieja. As many of you know, this is Beer Week, so happy Beer Week. And for some reason, not quite sure why, we're doing a virtual tasting of our beer. So the star of the show today is going to be our new sample packs. The thing that is really nice, we've invested in a canning machine. So now we can make 16-ounce cans. So we'll encourage you to take beer home, and in this case, we're going to encourage you to take a 4-pack home. It's a variety pack, so there's one of 4 beers in here, 2 of our standard, our favorite beers, and 2 newer beers, which we're going to discuss today. So we're going to talk about what it takes to make beer, give you just kind of a quick dive into how you would make beer, and then we're going to talk about what it is about the beer that we make that might be different than others. We have a lot of our customers and clients come in that are very excited about the beer because they're finding flavors that they don't find in other breweries, and I can explain why that is to you today. So the first beer we're going to talk about is going to be the red ale. See, I just showed you how to extract the beer from this nice little 4-pack carrier. It's kind of violent, but it is what you need to do in order to get the beers ready to drink. So what we're going to do first is we're going to talk about our red ale. Now, it is the Duke's Red Ale, and for those of you that have been here to the brewery, you've heard the story of the 16th century painting that we found in the wall of Casa Vieja. So if you haven't heard that story, I would encourage you to ask about it next time you're in the brewery, which we hope is going to be quite soon. The red ale is a traditional red ale. Some would call it an Irish red ale. It has a very simple malt bill, and it is a very easy, light beer to drink. So a little bit about how we make beer. What you see here in front of you is basically the recipe for beer. First of all, we have what we call a malt. What malt is barley that has been malted. Now what the maltster does, and I'm not the maltster, I am the beer whisperer. The beers speak to me. So I purchase the malt, and what they do is they take barley and they soak it in water and they spread it out on a flat surface and wait for it to sprout. Now, just before it sprouts, they dry it. And the reason they do that is that it maximizes the sugars and the starches in the malt that is going to be the building block that we need in order to make alcohol, which is an awfully important part of beer. The malt is, as you can tell from what we have here on this little sample plate here, it's various colors. Much like coffee is roasted, so is malt. So you start with a pale malt, which is what we use for our IPA, our Hoppy Birthday IPA. This is our most popular beer. And just, a little fun fact, the reason it's called Hoppy Birthday is it came out of the fermenter when on my birthday and Maria's birthday, which is a few days away, and from my birthday. But that's why it's Hoppy Birthday. So to make beer, basically all we're going to do is extract the sugar and the starches from malt, which means we crush it, put hot water in it, leach out the sugars, and then we put them in a boil kettle and we add hops. Now, these little pellets here are the hops pellets that are grown in Oregon. They're harvested once a year, and there's only about 100 different hops varieties. So much like an artist, we're going to paint a beer, and that allows us to use all different ingredients, and each one of those ingredients adds a flavor to the beer. So that's the hops, And then finally, what really does the work is yeast. And this is a packet of yeast that we'll use in one of our new beers that we're creating. And so after we have leached the sugar and we have boiled it, we go ahead and put the yeast in once we've cooled it down to about 70 degrees. And we let the yeast convert that sugar into alcohol. The final step is to add carbonation, and then we have beer that's ready to drink. Now, back to the red ale. We'll open up this red ale. We'll pour it into our official Casa Vieja glass here. This is a logo glass, and if you don't have one, if you'll come into the brewery, we'll make sure that you get one, because we'd sure like everyone to have one to remind them of their favorite Corrales Brewery. So the red ale, you'll notice that it has a red cast or color to it, and it also has a nice white head on it. And if you smell it, you can actually smell one of the main ingredients that we add at the very end, which is Valencia orange peel. So it gives it a kind of a slight citrusy taste. It also gives this kind of a nice crisp taste to the beer. It, as I say, is a very smooth beer. It also has a number of different malts in it, so it gives you a caramely, malty taste, but not a lot of bitterness. I'm not a big fan of bitter beer, and since it's my brewery, we don't do a lot of bitter beers, but other places do, and that's what they do. Now, the other thing I wanted to talk about is this yeast that I showed you is actually an ale yeast, and there is also what's called a lager yeast. They're both strains of yeast, and what makes them different is they ferment at different temperatures. So if we're talking about an ale, it is a top fermenting yeast. It typically will ferment at around 70 degrees, and it is a very fast yeast. Now, its cousin, which would be the lager yeast, is ferments at a much lower temperature. It's going to ferment from 55 all the way down to 35 degrees. So it's very slow to ferment, but it ferments very cleanly, so there's not a lot of flavors added from the yeast, and that's how we get the crisp lagers that we have on tap. Now, this one here is a very fun beer. This is called doppelbock, and if you speak German, you know that doppel is German for double, and bock is the type of beer that it is, and it is also identified as a specific region in Germany that this beer comes from. This is a beer that was very popular in the 17th century. It is kind of a cool story, is that the beer in that region actually changed the architecture of the buildings there, because it was a communal brewing process. So in other words, in order to boil the beer, they had this really big kettle that they did their beer in, and they passed it around, and the beer making season, because they didn't have refrigeration, was very, very short. So they'd actually have a lottery to see who got to brew beer, and in order to get this into their courtyard, they had to have big arches, because it was a very large kettle, because they made beer in very large quantities. So this happens to be a lager. Again, the region that it comes from is very cold, so the beer had to be able to ferment at lower temperatures, and you will see a much lighter color, and you see a beautiful brown, creamy head on this beer. Double refers to the amount of alcohol in it, so it has a much higher alcohol content than does the red, but it has a tremendously strong malt flavor. Now, when I say malt, I'm not talking about, you know, the malted milk that you're used to. I'm talking about the grains. So this has kind of like a granola bar or a breakfast cereal. It's got a very oats. It again is not a bitter beer. It's a very smooth beer, and it's quite appropriate for a global pandemic in that it has a very high alcohol content that you can't taste. So if you want the memories of our current situation to fade, this is an excellent beer to concentrate on. It will get the job done quickly. Now I'm going to talk about our Ghost Stout. This is a beer that we are very excited about. It is from a category that's real popular right now called a white stout. Now, for those of you that are familiar with stout, this is our Irish Sunrise Stout. You can see how almost black it is, and it has a nice creamy head on it. And this one is made in the Guinness style, so it has a very low alcohol content. Now, what's interesting about Guinness, just kind of a fun fact, is that if you're worried about the calories in beer, it's not really intuitive that you would drink Guinness, but as it turns out, the low alcohol content and the grain bill gets you a beer that is very, very close in calories to Bud Light. So, you know, if you want to lose weight, drink stout. That's my advice. The typical stout, very, very dark. It has chocolate flavors. It has coffee flavors. And in this case, it's very, very smooth. Now, that gives us an opportunity to talk about why our beers are different. If you look at the malts that are on this plate here, you see this malt. This is what's called a base malt. It is a very light color, almost a Pilsner style malt, but it is back to the barley. They dried it, but they didn't really roast it. So it is got all of the sugar that we want in it, but it doesn't have any flavor. Now, this right here next to it, you can see the difference in color. This is what's called a Maris Otter. Now, this is my favorite malt to use in beer because it adds such complexity to the beer. If you go to England, which is where this malt is famous and where it's grown and actually where it's imported from, it is a extremely flavorful product, and it just adds just a wonderful taste to the beer. So that's what we use in our stout. It's also what we use in our white stout. Now, the difference between a traditional stout and a white stout is really right here. You know, to get the chocolate flavors and the coffee flavors, we're going to use a extremely roasted, almost burned malt. And that gives you the color, it also gives you the flavor. So that's how you make a traditional stout. Well, to make a white stout, we start out with Maris Otter, and we use oats just like you would in a normal stout. But what you find is that you notice the color difference here. You know, if this is a stout, this is why we call this a white stout. It has a very nice white head on it, and you can see the light color, kind of like an amber ale. And the reason for that is we use the Maris Otter, which you can see has a little bit of color to it, but we don't use any of the dark grains, so we don't get the color and we don't get the chocolate and the coffee flavor from the grain that we normally would. But see, now that's what makes brewing fun for us, is that myself and our assistant brewer, Michael Sharp, came up with a number of processes to get flavors. Like in this case, this is a organic cacao, and it is from, in this case, Uganda. And if you've never had organic cacao, I would recommend that you get yourself some, because what you see is it looks like ground up chocolate, and it has the very nice flavor chocolate, and that is, you know, the main ingredient in chocolate. So what we do for the brewing is we'll take that and crush it, and then we'll leach that chocolate flavor out into a neutral alcohol, and that's what we use to flavor our white stout. Well, the thing on the white stout is that Michael and I were sitting, you know, with 3 different types of chocolate flavors that we had made, that we wanted to decide which one was going to make it into the beer. Well, what we noticed is one of them gave a wonderful chocolate aroma. One of them gave a nice milk chocolate flavor, and another one gave kind of a dark chocolate aftertaste. So I don't know if it was because of the number of samples that we had or just that we're givers, but the bottom line is all 3 went into this beer. So when you go to drink this beer, start by tasting or checking the aroma, because you'll get a very strong chocolate taste. Then you'll get milk chocolate, then you'll get dark chocolate, and then at the very end you get the coffee kick. Now again, this is a higher alcohol beer, so again it's very pandemic appropriate, and this has been very, very popular for us. Everyone that tastes it kind of goes, why do you call it a stout? And then they taste it and they go, well, it tastes like a stout, but it doesn't look like a stout. And that's the point. Now, in this particular beer, you know, as I mentioned, it's called a white stout, but that isn't any fun. And in you know, Casa Vieja, we certainly have a lot of questions about the paranormal activity at Casa Vieja. So in honor of that, we refer to this as our ghost stout. So a very fun beer. All right, so you'll notice that in our variety pack you have 4 beers, and the beauty of having 4 beers is that, you know, if you come to the tap room, we're going to limit you to 3 beers because we want you to be safe on your trip home. But since you're at home doing this virtually, go for 4, and if 4 isn't enough, 8 will always be appropriate when you're at home. So finally, our IPA. The IPA, which I think a lot of you already know this story, IPA stands for India Pale Ale. I mean, this was a beer that was developed in England in order to supply beer to the troops that were fighting in India. According to Britain, they weren't fighting. According to India, they were. We're not going to get into that because we're in the beer business. The IPA, what they were doing is they were trying to ship their standard beers to India, and they would spoil in the voyage because, again, they didn't have any refrigeration, and they would take it and put it into the bottom of the hold in the ship to try to get it to be cold so that when it got to India, the troops could enjoy it, and it was undrinkable. And somebody figured out that the original reason that hops was added to beer is because it had a preserving quality. It would actually preserve beer. So somebody decided, well, hey, let's go ahead and boost the hops. Didn't make any difference. Let's double it. Didn't make any difference. Let's triple it. Didn't make any difference. So the Hoppy Birthday IPA has 7 kinds of hops in it. And if you put enough hops in a beer, it will preserve it, and that's where the IPA came from, is a beer that could be shipped without refrigeration to India, and the troops developed quite a taste for it. When they returned, they still had a taste for it, and one thing we know for sure, if you've had an extremely hoppy beer, nothing else will satisfy you. So IPAs in New Mexico, very, very popular. Has a lot to do with the water chemistry in New Mexico. The very, very hard water lends itself to making IPAs, so IPAs are very nice to make. You will notice the color of this beer is very cloudy. This is what we refer to as a hazy IPA, and the importance of a hazy IPA is it's what is popular on the East Coast, so this is referred to as an East Coast IPA, as opposed to a West Coast IPA, which if a West Coast IPA would be more the color of our Ghost Stout. And this is cloudy because not only does it give it a nice creaminess to the beer, a nice mouthfeel, it also allows us to put different ingredients in it to assist in the flavor, but it's all about hops. Hops, hops, and more hops. Well, if you take hops and you boil them, you get bitter flavors. And that's what you're going to find in a West Coast IPA. Think La Cumbre's Elevated. West Coast, extremely good beer, but not for the faint of heart. Well, we refer to our IPA as an East Coast IPA, and in that case, the 6 of the 7 types of hops that we use are added after the boil for aroma or during fermentation. And what that does is it gives you all of the aroma of the hops, but it doesn't give you extreme bitterness. So this is what we refer to as our gateway IPA. And that's because, you know, people that like IPA can drink it, and people that have always wanted to drink IPA can drink it. And what you find is it's like going to the islands. You know, it has a very, very tropical, you know, guava, pineapple aroma and citrusy. And when you try it, there is a little bit of bitterness, but then there is also just kind of an explosion of different hops flavors that are very pleasing. So that's why it's our most popular beer. It kind of covers both sides of the fence. And so again, thank you for spending your time. If you've purchased our beer, thank you very much. We love making the beer, and it's, you know, back to the final point of what it is that we do differently than the big breweries, production breweries do. When you go to a brewery and you see a big silo at the brewery, it's filled with this light-colored, non-tasting, what they call base malt. And then they'll, you know, take the base malt and then they'll put a little bit of color or flavor in it to try to make the whatever kind of beer they're making. But the point is, and what we do here is we use the grain that is specific to the style of beer. It's more expensive, it takes more time, and so our beers cost us a lot more to make, but in return for that, you get a lot more flavor. So if the world goes as we expect it, we're going to be open soon again. Come enjoy our patio. A lot of the performers that we have come and you know, work at Casa Vieja while you enjoy your happy hour are anxious to come back, and we're anxious to see you. Thanks for your time today.